Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, the 5 leading causes of railway platforms, accidents, and injuries. During today's webinar, our presenter, Carl Berkowitz, will cover the following: the gap between the platform and the rail car, platform overcrowding, slips, trips, and falls on platforms, ramps, stairs, and escalators, premature rail car door closing and door capture incidents, train operator and station personnel. Today's webinar will feature Carl Berkowitz. Carl is a transportation and traffic expert with over 46 years of experience. Mr. Berkowitz's areas of expertise include accident studies, slip, trip, and fall, pedestrian accidents, perception reaction capabilities, subway and commuter rail accidents, speed and distance analysis, and railroad grade crossing. If you have a question that pertains to the presentation, we do ask that you use the Q&A or the chat feature, which is found on the right-hand side of the screen. Carl will do his best to answer your questions during the 2 question and answer breaks. Tomorrow morning, I will be sending out a link to the archived recording of this webinar, and we do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after the program is over. I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished presenter, Carl. Carl, the presentation is all yours.
Thank you very much, Matt. Let me jump to the next, which you covered already. Anyway, in the beginning, I would like to give you a little bit of background about this subject matter, and let me begin right away. One of the things we sort of take for granted, and it's probably one of the most complicated things that we do, and that's walking. It's a basic activity, and is a key factor in operating a rail passenger platform, although not given much consideration in most cases. We have a general tendency to blame the rail passenger when there's an accident. Usually we find that transportation companies or anyone says that the accident was caused because the person wasn't careful, wasn't watching where they were going. One of the things to keep in mind when dealing with public agencies, and this is from New York State and applies to most states, and that's this qualified immunity, where if municipalities adhere to their guidelines, then they're exempt from the injuries that might be caused as a result of their adhering to their guidelines, and that is called qualified immunity. It's my feeling that there is a duty of care required, and pardon my levity with the little joke in the corner, but the important duties of care are to warn passengers of dangers, to properly train the personnel to deal with dangers or hazards, have safety inspections on a regular basis, provide effective communication of when there is a hazard or a danger, provide platform personnel when there is a dangerous or hazardous situation, and to ensure that design standards are always updated as a result of industry changes in standards and guidelines, in particular the American Disabilities Act. There's so many codes out there, it's sometimes confusing to people, but the primary standards and guidelines that we have in the United States related to platform safety are the ones that are indicated by the logos on the side. And one thing to bear in mind, that a standard is really developed as a consensus. It's generally the minimum that one should do, and not necessarily that we should be at the minimum level. And because of the consensus requirement to build a standard or a guideline, not all situations are covered by standards and codes. And one of the things that should always be done is that there should be risk assessments on a regular basis to determine the level of risk and how to achieve compliance and how to create an acceptable situation for the situation in hand. Here is some of the codes that are out there. There's the Institute of Transportation Engineers, the American National Standards Institute, AFTM, the U.S. Access Board, which is the ADA standards, the U.S. Department of Transportation, the industry group in transit, rail transit, is the American Public Transit Association, and there are a lot of engineering groups out there, and that's the American Society of Civil Engineers, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and then we have the Uniform Building Code, which is now morphed into the International Building Code, the IBC. There is a sense there's a hierarchy of control. The first thing one can do is remove the hazard in the first place in the design process. If that isn't done, then the next step is reduce the hazard through redesign or through engineering controls. And if that isn't enough, then through information systems, automatic and manual warnings and signs, and of course, on a regular basis, inspection and training of personnel. Platform hazard prevention. This is sort of like a misnomer for what I'm going to discuss, but this is the process one needs to really go through to understand what hazards are out there. And first is root causes, which involves the search for those factors that cause gap accidents in the first place, and to try to seek from among the available data the nature of the causes that lead to the undesirable consequences, which result in injuries. Causations, the factors that present when you have a gap accident, such as a horizontal, a vertical gap, a combination of the two, the lack of information systems, the knowledge and experience of staff, the training and retraining programs of staff, the use of platform tactile strips. Those are those yellow strips you see at the edge of platforms. In some cases, the placement of rubbing boards at the edge of the platform so the train can park closer. Also, something that's being used is extending the door sills with extender plates and, of course, lighting. Important in preventing accidents is the accident investigation itself. Sometimes there's a failure to collect hard facts, what happened, and by knowing what happened, we can remove or prevent that in the future. And there's a need to ensure that a thorough analysis and a step-by-step procedure is created so we get a clear picture of what caused the accident. In many places, as I mentioned early on, when a passenger is injured, it's normally the opinion is that it's the result of human error on the part of the person who's injured and not any fault of anyone else other than the individual who's injured. Important is to have safety inspection practices, and this is very, very important. Many times inspections are started, but they're never completed to understand the defect. Usually when an inspection is undertaken, it's by somebody who's in a hurry, and they really never get to find the problem and the location of the problem. And in many cases, the inspectors are not experienced in the area and sometimes obtain the job by default and really don't know what to look for or how to analyze an injury. Design and construction is very important, and this way we can design out the defect before there is a defect. And it's important to have written procedures, so inadequate procedures can cause accidents, and so that similar situations don't keep recurring, and that everybody is sensitive to the safety operation and maintains the level of capability to respond to some safety situation. And this can be accomplished further by tracking accidents, so we know where they are recurring, and to ensure that they don't, that mistake once, but not a mistake a second time. And of course, having a safety program, and having a safety program that's well understood by everybody, and that actions can be taken to solve a particular safety issue, and to ensure that corrections are made the first time and not after. In the case of, for example, in New York State, on Long Island, actions on gap accidents didn't occur until after a period of 10 years. There were 1,000 such accidents. Two types of gaps. One is the horizontal, and the other is the vertical, and both are equally important. And in most cases, one seems to be concerned with the horizontal and neglecting the vertical. Both are important. There are two types of platforms. There's the low-level platform, where one has to step up into the rail car, and then, of course, the high-level platform where you go straight in. This is a picture in Tokyo and the famous pushes. The other issue that is of interest in terms of gaps is whether it's a convex platform or a concave platform. And as you can see with the example here in the car, that the gap is different depending on along the car, depending if it's a convex or a concave. In the case of a convex, the bigger gap is at the ends of the car, train car, and in the case of a concave, the bigger gap is in the middle of the rail car. Again, as I mentioned earlier, that it's important to consider both the vertical and horizontal gap. There's been numerous studies in this area, and particularly I'd like to point to two, one in England and one in the Netherlands, where they found that the gap distance for both the horizontal and the vertical together should never exceed 200 millimeters, which is about 7.9 inches. And that includes whether the vertical gap is above the platform or below the platform. Both are concerns. One concerns tripping, and the other one concerns MISSTEP. We'll talk about that. There are various attributes that can be considered that can reduce the dangers of boarding or disembarking from a rail car. And the first, of course, is accessibility, where you have full accessibility for all users and that the station platform meets ADA requirements. Active warning is important, where you have accurate and functionally informing the passengers of any hazards so that they can know what to do and how to handle it, and this is usually provided through automatic message signs and regular announcements. In terms of level boarding area, the level between the edge of the platform and the rail car should meet the ADA standards, which is in the horizontal should be in the range of 3 to 4 inches, and in the vertical not to exceed 1.5 inches. The area in which people board should have clarity. It should be obvious where one is embarking or disembarking, and it should be clear. There should be no obstructions or hazards, making the path that the passenger is following relatively level and resistance to slipping. Everything should be conspicuous, ensure that the potential hazard, if there is one, comes to the attention of the passenger. It should be continuous path with no gaps or changes in elevation. There should be detectable warnings, such as that is provided by the ADA, the tactile strip. Any warning should be discernible. Passengers need to be able to perceive a hazard, and while they can make that appropriate action, so they can avoid the hazard. One thing in safety is everything should be expected. So we have to ensure that information is provided to capture the passenger's attention and communicate any essential information. Information should be visible, clearly identifiable, easy to understand, and provided not at the scene of the potential hazard, but in advance, it should be advance warning. And of course, there should be passive warning, static messages, regulatory signs, warning signs, guide signs, platform markers, and of course, we should have everything meeting the ADA requirements. Lighting should be good, so there's security, the surface should be smooth, and everything should be visible. And of course, this applies not only for boarding, but for disembarking as well. These are the standards that are out there for platform safety, and the STARS is the European Union, and also the British government, which plays a big role in the research in this area. A second area is platform crowding, and platform crowding is the result of various factors that influence passenger behavior. And some of the factors that affect crowding are just the basic design and the fixed aspects of the platform. And there are other aspects that are flexible and can be influenced by actions taken by the train station staff. Some of those areas that we need to understand is the layout, the environment, how the crowd flows, individual factors that affect crowding, the information and communication systems, and other crowding management factors which may be unique to that particular location. Here's a little bit of a way of queuing in to an accident, and this is if you see the whole body, you know you don't have a crowding problem. If you see the bodies one on top of another, you know you're beginning to have a crowding problem. If you only see the people up to their shoulders, you know the crowding is getting more serious. And if you only see heads, then you know for sure that there's a serious crowding problem. And in any of the second and third and fourth areas, one needs to take action to prevent those situations from happening, because crowding just becomes an accumulating factor, and you can quickly go from 2 to 4. The factors for crowding are numerous, such as the layout of the platform, obstructions on the platform, where the access and egress is located, the time passengers arrive and depart, the train timetables, how many different train lines are using the same platform, coordination with other modes of transportation, weather, restrictions for passenger flow, areas where passengers could be in conflict, gathering points, et cetera, and et cetera, whether extra staff is needed on short notice and can be provided. Does the operator have a crowd management program? If there's a sudden system delay, what impact does that have on crowding? Also, one fails sometimes. We say, oh, this platform is quite long and a lot of places for people to be stored, but there are sections of the platform, like the ends where the train doesn't stop, which are not used and can't be counted on in terms of a crowding situation. You also need to be cognizant of sign areas and benches and stairs and columns and other obstructions, and how that impacts the crowd on the platform. And of course, one of the major ways of maintaining and controlling crowd, short of having staff out there, including police, is to have effective information and to intercept the passengers before the crowding situation is created in the first place. One of the concepts, it's an old concept, and the concept that we use in terms of understanding platform usage is what we call level of service, and this was developed in 1971 by John Fruin, and it was interesting. He was my teacher when I was going to graduate school, and I worked on this project, and I never expected at the time that this would become the pedestrian international standard for understanding the movement of people in various situations. In terms of walking on a platform, this is the amount of square feet that is needed, level of service A, which is free flow, complete free flow, as is level of service B, and as we get more crowded, the amount of square feet that is needed per person. A lot of properties, transportation properties, try to design for level of service C, where each individual has between 15 and 25 square feet in which to move around the platform. When we reach a level of service 8, F, we're basically looking at that crowd situation where we saw just the heads of the individuals, and level of service E, we can sometimes see the bodies of the individuals, but we're getting to a situation where we're almost going to reach a point where we barely can see the bodies of the individuals, and mostly we're getting to see their upper bodies. And so that's why most transportation properties want a safe system that operates and designed in terms of level of service C, which is 15 to 25 square feet per individual. That's for walking, and on a platform, we're basically also concerned with the situation of where people are queuing up to get off the platform, queuing up to board trains, queuing up to get off trains, queuing up to get on an elevator, queuing up to get on an escalator. And again here, designers like to use a level of service C, which is 7 to 10 square feet per person, as the level of service for a safe platform for the purpose of queuing for either boarding or getting off the train or what have you. And you can see how tight it gets when we start moving down to level of service D, level of service E, and level of service A, F, where it's level of service A, F is analogous to everybody riding in an elevator with no room to get on the elevator. Everybody's just shoulder to shoulder. And as we know, people don't like to be too close. In the United States, we like to have a distance between us, and in other countries, they will tolerate close distances between people, but in the United States, we don't tolerate very well being one on top of another. Level of service E and F is really not considered acceptable in our society in the United States. Level of service D is pushing the envelope a little bit. Matt, do we want to entertain some questions at this point?
Oh, definitely. We do have some questions that have come into the queue, and I think we'd encourage all who are on the line, if you do have any questions, please use the chat or Q&A feature down on the right-hand side of the screen to submit them to Carl. We have a question here that came in from Jen, who asks, what are some industry guidelines and standards for horizontal and vertical gaps?
The American Disabilities Act recommends 3 inches, and for new facilities, it's the requirement. For horizontal, they recommend 3 inches, and for the vertical, they recommend 1.5 inches vertical above the platform or vertical below the platform. The New York City Transit Authority has a standard where they try to maintain 1.5 inches and are adverse to a gap where the rail car is below the platform. In Europe, they tend to adhere to 60 millimeters, which is approximately, I would guess, maybe 2.5 inches. In England, as I mentioned, the study, they prefer no more than 200 millimeters, which is 7.9 inches in horizontal and vertical, with not having all the gap in the vertical or all the gap in the horizontal, but some kind of even balance between the two. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great. We now have a question here from Tom, who asks, why do there seem to be more pedestrian-related platform accidents today than in years past? You hear about them in the news, and he was wondering why are they so prevalent now? What has changed?
Well, basically, it was the method of reporting. As I mentioned earlier, when a passenger was injured, they generally attributed to human error on the part of the passenger. Recently, the federal government has mandated that all transit properties need to develop a system safety program plan. So, and with the experiences that have taken place on Long Island, where a young lady a couple of years back was injured, accidents are now being properly classified, and people have become a bit more litigious than they were in the past. Because in the past, people said, oh, I'm injured, it's my fault, and now people are beginning to realize that maybe it isn't their fault, and maybe the fault is of a second party or a third party. So accidents actually have gone down, but the litigantness, I guess if that's the term, people are more now apt to sue than they were in the past.
Okay, great. We now have a question here from Carol asks, what are the greatest challenges facing the public transportation systems, railways, subways, now in 2010? Where are you seeing the most accidents?
The most accidents are occurring in the same areas as they always occurred. Slips, trips and falls, trespassing into the right-of-way, at railroad crossings. Basically, in fact, unfortunately, railroad crossing accidents, for the first time in the last 10 years, I think this year we had an increase, or in 2009 there was an increase in the number of accidents. Sometimes as records improve, safety records improve, people become a little lax. And there's always a need to train when people leave, and there's always a need for retraining, recertification, bringing people up to date. And I find that on the books there's a lot of good training, but in reality that training is not being passed along, such as what TASA is doing, passed along to the employees that need that information.
And a follow-up to that, how could the systems mitigate that risk? Like, how could they reduce some of the things you highlighted, especially with the increase in railroad accidents?
Is by being diligent and by, as I mentioned, by doing good safety investigations and training personnel to become aware and to do all. If you can't remove it through design, then we have to look to other ways to, to make improvements by retrofitting, by information. You have to do them all. Safety requires not just a token application, but requires a lot of diligence and a lot of hard work. And I found in some cases that when they measure the cost of the diligence versus the cost of just paying off on claims, sometimes the decision is made to pay off on claims. I don't think that's the way to go.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so for everybody that's in attendance, we're going to take a second or a final Q&A break towards the conclusion of the presentation of content. But please don't hesitate to submit your questions via the chat or Q&A feature, and we'll get them to Dr. Berkowitz, and he'll include them during the next Q&A break. So why don't we continue on with the presentation of content?
Thank you, Matt. The next subject I want to address is slips, missteps, trips, and falls. We always hear the term slip, trips, and falls, but there's this other issue of missteps, and I'd like to talk about it a little bit. And this is some of the signage that is out there. The sign about caution falling people is a joke that was put up by one railroad property somewhere, and I just happened to pick that up on the internet, and I thought it was quite cute. And the reason I put that in is because they say engineers are not very funny. Let me give you a little bit of background. As a passenger, we always expect that we're going to be safe and that the environment, when we travel on public transportation and rail especially, that it's going to be safe for us. And basically what happens is that we don't expect that there's going to be a dangerous condition, and we're not made aware of it. And the one thing that needs to be borne in mind, which I mentioned briefly, is that if there's a sudden design change and we don't offer some obvious visual cues to the passenger, and we don't bring it to their attention, and they're not able to address it, then what's going to happen is that they're not going to be able to distinguish the accident and not be able to prevent from being involved in an accident. And as I mentioned in passing some of these subjects, slips, missteps, trips, and falls are the direct result of poor design, poor maintenance, uneven walking surfaces, changes in elevation, a slippery surface, and when we have restricted movement as a result of overcrowding or other restrictions on the area where people are moving back and forth. And the best practices are really very basic. The cost of safety is a lot less expensive than the cost of accidents. And most important, the basic fundamental level is really to try to remove the accident in the first place. And I haven't really come across a platform accident that could not have been easily prevented. And if the property understood the danger, identified the danger, identified the location, and quickly made the effort to eliminate the hazard. Some of the preventive measures for slip, mishaps, trips, and falls are using passive and active information devices, having information systems, signage and bulletins and brochures, and of course cleaning, maintaining, and repairing the walking surface. To understand what happens when there's an accident involving walking, it's important to understand what walking is all about. And as I mentioned in the beginning, walking is perhaps the most complicated function that a human has to perform. We always are thrilled when that 11 and 12-month-old baby starts walking. We forget how long the baby was trying to move from the crawling stage to the walking stage. And walking is basically an activity of imbalance. We keep walking forward progressively on a level surface, and what happens is that as we walk forward, the ground that is supporting us on every step we take forward is supporting the body. We go from imbalance to balance on every step, and if each foot receives that support, then nothing happens. We walk along safely. It's when that balance is lost that we have that accident. And let's look at the slipping type of hazard. This basically occurs when one is walking forward and the surface is not able to hold the foot when it steps down. And what happens, the surface between the shoe or the foot of the individual and the surface has insufficient friction to support the body, and what happens is that the body slips, and because there's inadequate surface friction, one foot slips out, or if a person is supported, the cane slips out, and what we have is a fall backwards. The types of falls of this type is where one or both feet slide forward, causing the person to slip on the walking surface, or the lead foot slips forward, but the trailing foot does not, or the body collapses in a split configuration, or we have a sideways slip that results when, when somebody's trying to make a turn and they slip in the process of turning and fall. Just to give you a simple understanding of friction, this is one of Newton's original 3 laws. And what we have is when we're walking, our weight is holding the body down against the surface, and there's an equal and opposite force that is coming up from the surface. And friction is measured by the force that is required to push our weight forward. And usually that force is less than the weight of our weight. And the closer that force is to our weight, we have a coefficient of 1. And the coefficient of friction is a relation between the weight of our body and the force that's required to move that body forward. And generally it's recommended that that coefficient should be greater than 0.5, and the greater the better, because the greater the coefficient of friction, the less there is a possibility of slipping. And there are 2 types of friction. One is static and one is dynamic. Static friction is that when the object is not moving, when we're standing still, and dynamic is in the process of moving. And of course, while a body is in motion, the coefficient of friction would be somewhat less than if it was measured in a static situation. There is various equipment out there to measure coefficient of friction. There is a standard, the ATM standard for using these machines. There are innumerable machines out there, and there are many people who earn a living from this, and there's a lot of laboratory work, and each machine gives you a slightly different answer. And the one thing that all the machines agree on, even though they don't agree on the measurement of coefficient of friction, they all agree that the higher the coefficient of friction, the better. That's sort of an obvious statement. A tripping hazard is caused by some kind of obstruction in the pathway, and that's some kind of raise in the walking surface, where the heel of the individual is caught, and a result of the heel getting caught, the toe, as a result of the toe getting caught, the person falls forward. And this is a kind of situation if you have a platform gap where the rail car is below the platform, when the person is trying to get off, that trailing foot will hit the platform and cause it a trip. So one of the standards that has been developed is a standard that, in the American Disabilities Act, that they recommend that no protrusion from a walking surface be greater than 0.25 inches, and if it's greater than 0.25 inches to 0.5 inches, it should be slow. That's what the standard says. MISSTEP is when you're walking along, and as you can see from these signs, which are used by the New York Metro MTA in both their Metro North operation, excuse me, and their Long Island Railroad operation. And a MISSTEP is when there's a change in elevation and one is walking along and one falls into that change of elevation. And this can be very significant, and the significance of the injury that can result from MISSTEP is really a function of the size of the change in elevation and the passenger's expectation of that change. Slips and falls will occur whenever the body movement shifts and when the body is too far off its center of gravity. The center of gravity is generally somewhere within our body, and when that center of gravity falls behind our body or ahead of our body, we're either going to fall backwards or we're going to fall forward. And I think the Chinese sign is kind of indicative of slip and fall down, and if you're slipping and falling down, do it carefully. Stairs are another matter. When you're climbing stairs, your center of gravity is forward, and when you're descending stairs, your center of gravity is in back of you. And a way to have safe stairs is if we design the stairs in accordance with the standards and codes that are out there, and the building codes primarily, and that the riser height and the tread depth are consistent. Inconsistency is the surest way of creating an accident on stairs. One also, in a transit operation, one also has to be concerned about the width of the stairs to accommodate traffic. And of course, stairs, like any other walking surface, are subject to maintenance issues, and they need to be scheduled regularly for inspection. Ramps are a slightly different issue. The steepness of the ramp can affect the safety of the ramp and also the coefficient of friction. If you have a low coefficient of friction and a steep slope, you can see what the potential for accident could be. We need to be concerned about concrete wearing too smoothly. Concrete generally is a surface with good friction, but if it smooths out like any other smooth material, it can result in a dangerous condition. And slopes should have handrails to assist if the slope is not of a gradual nature. Escalator issues, there are more accidents on escalators than there should be. Some of the accidents occur because of the excessive speed. In Russia, the first time I rode the escalators in Russia, they were moving at such a rapid pace, but somehow when they get to the bottom, they slow down. I don't know exactly how they do it, and there are very few accidents. And we want to ensure that the stairs and the banisters are of equal speed, and that there are no sudden stops, and that if there are children using, that the children are supervised, and that we got to warn people that there's always a possibility of fingers and clothing getting caught in the escalator. Another area of concern, and has received a lot of press, and that's train door accidents, and that's where the doors close prematurely and they capture a person suddenly. And some of these are on the right-hand side are some of the headlines that I've taken from the newspapers. Doors close on passenger's neck. A young child is caught on a stroller. There was a picture in the newspapers of a person caught in the door, mooning the people on the platform. A woman died after a hand got caught in the door and she was dragged along. Baby strollers, pictures of baby strollers getting caught in the doors, and people being held captive and trapped and departing and dragging people along the platform. These are serious accidents, and a lot of serious injuries are occurring, and these door capture accidents are still occurring. And there is a program that's undertaken by the National Academy of Science, Transportation Research Board, where they are working with transit properties, where the transit properties are sending them information which they are collating and evaluating to try to improve the system throughout the United States. Some of the other door incidents that occur: doors fail to open or close, or there's a failure of the interlock and the train pulls out with the doors open. There have been examples of doors opening between stations. There are many cases of incorrect door operations where they open on the wrong side. Of course, obstructions where there is no detection and people are dragged, and doors which are freewheel, they open and close and open and close, and the train pulls out with the doors open and closing. And in many cases, there's also the case where doors fail to completely close and the train pulls out and injuries occur. Unsafe operations occur where most transit operations are designed where accelerations and decelerations are held to a limit which is called the jerk rate, which is a rate of acceleration which can prove dangerous to a passenger, which can cause a passenger to fall and perhaps injure themselves. Of course, other things that happen is because of the car suspension system, the car can sway and also can cause accidents. One solution, of course, is maintaining the motors in the track so that the cars don't sway, and also to train and closely supervise train operators so they don't exceed the jerk acceleration rate. Passengers end up falling on tracks. Some of the primary causes are medical reasons, slip, trip, and fall, suicide, being pushed by a crowd, and lately we've seen a lot of people retrieving their iPods and iPhones and iPads and disastrous consequences as a result. The train operator has a lot of responsibilities. The train operator's primary focus when they enter a station is to focus on picking up and discharging the passengers. They are not prepared for a chance encounter of a track intrusion. That is when somebody falls to the track. Their focus is on bringing the train into the station and loading the passengers. And there is little training that goes on in guiding operators into observing or looking for that which they are not usually seeing, and that is an unusual circumstance. Events have to be expected. If an unexpected event occurs, there's the risk that it won't be seen. We all have a tendency of look, but not always seeing everything. The operators, in general, always operate in a predictable and lawful manner, and they work long, hard hours, and they focus their attention on what their job skills require them to, and that's to bring the train in safely. So if there's an unusual circumstance and they're not prepared for it, sometimes we could have an emergency, and sometimes the consequences could be disastrous for that passenger which has entered the right-of-way of the train. One of the things that we find in trying to evaluate these situations that when we ask questions about what happened, we tend to find something like a Roshamon, where everybody asked has a slightly different report as to what actually happened. We don't have a recorded memory. It's only the memory of the individual. There's no, in cases of some transit properties now, they're installing video cameras, so we do have that recorded memory, and they're asking that the written documentation reports be done as quickly after the accident as possible so that the best possible record can be obtained of the accident. Some of the human errors that occur that result in accidents are the lack of attention, the inability to see or hear specific features, inadequate knowledge, violation of the rules, violation of procedures, an unintended action, slip or a lapse, and just plain old tiredness and fatigue. Things happen so quickly, and generally the person who has to respond takes approximately 1 second for the person to perceive, if they do perceive, and to be able to react. And that process is a 5-step process where you see what you can see, and it becomes visible. And if it's a passenger in the right-of-way, the passenger is seen, and the operator sees the passenger in the path. What happened is understood, and the operator recognizes the situation and determines what action to be taken, and the operator moves to take that action, and the action is completed, and the end result of that action is an emergency braking situation. And it sounds like a long time, but these things generally take about a second to occur. And if the operator is well trained, it could even take less than a second. And some transit properties are now using simulator systems to better train the operators so that this approximate 1 second can be reduced to even a lesser time. Just to let you know, if a train is going at 10 miles an hour, it moves 15 feet in 1 second. And if it's moving 50 feet, which could be the length of a car, it takes 3.4 seconds at 10 miles an hour. If a train is going 10 miles an hour and applies the brakes, in an emergency situation, when the vehicle is empty, it takes 20 feet, and it takes 30 feet in a normal situation. So we are under a misimpression that you slam on the emergency brakes and you get a magnitude of 2 or 3 in terms of stopping. The improvements are only about 50% and sometimes even less than that. In a full-service operation, it's only 25%. In a full service, when you have a fully loaded vehicle, the emergency is only 10 feet less than, so it's 30 feet instead of 40 feet. And this is from studies that were done by the New York City Transit Authority, and are somewhat similar for other transit properties as well. So I wanted to leave you with one basic thought to think about, and that is, let's always think safety. My dad, who was a real estate attorney, and he always used to say to me that the most important thing in real estate is location, location, location. And the most important thing in terms of avoiding accidents on platforms is to think safety, 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 safety. And it's no more complicated than that. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carl. We're now going to take our second question and answer break, or final one. And we do have some questions here in the queue that I would like to get to. We have a question from Steve who asks, how do you determine the perception reaction time of an individual?
The perception and reaction times that are being used in the industry are a result of laboratory work that have been done by psychologists. In the United States, we haven't done a lot of work in terms of direct rail, direct work actually on the rail since the 70s. In Europe and in England, they are constantly doing those kinds of studies. And in the United States, we're constantly doing laboratory studies. And we're under the misimpression sometimes that all this research work is being done for the highway industry or the traffic engineers. Some work is being done for that, but laboratory work is really for any mode of transportation. It's testing people. There are actually out there some written tests that can be taken, and we need to do more, I guess, in the United States and test train operators to understand why these accidents occur and how we can improve their training by better understanding the perception and reaction time. So that's a good question.
Great. We have a question here, again from Tom, who asks, what are the key components of a maintenance and safety plan for a rail system or a subway system? What are some key components that you look for in safety and maintenance plans, and what are some key factors that you don't usually see in maintenance and safety plans?
One of the things we don't see is a regular scheduled inspection process. As I mentioned earlier, that each property is supposed to create a system safety plan program. In many cases, like any plan or program, it gets filed, or one or two people are familiar with it. Basically, by visiting the premises on a regular basis, developing flow charts and checklists for that particular service, noting if an accident occurs, why it occurred, and not to assume that it was human error on the part of the passenger, to ensure that all the standards that have been promulgated by all the different organizations have been applied, and that there is a system safety department within the agency to ensure that they're always addressing on a constant basis the issues. We find that when public opinion gets involved and when our governmental legislatures get involved, there's a big push on system safety. And then it disappears for a while, and then it comes back again. But it needs to be done on a regular basis, and we need to constantly train our personnel to be aware of what's going on and to deal with it and provide things as active and passive information systems, information signage, everything that will make our passenger aware of what's out there.
Okay, great. During some of the presentation today, you said that many of the accidents that you see are preventable. Why do you say that, and what steps should be taken by railway systems to prevent these pedestrian accidents?
In many cases, the accidents that I see, if they follow their own internal standards, the accident wouldn't have occurred. And then sometimes when question why they didn't follow their internal standards, well, they say we haven't budgeted for that as yet, or something to that nature. The properties have the people that can do the job, and what is needed is to let those people do their job.
Okay, great. I don't see any other questions in the queue, so I think we're going to wrap things up here. On behalf of Dr. Carl Berkowitz, I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us today. I thought you did a great presentation, Dr. Berkowitz. It was obvious that you put some time into it. And I thank those who joined us today for their questions. I thought the questions greatly enhanced the presentation. If you'd like to speak to Carl about a case or a project, please feel free to contact us here at TASA. Our telephone number is on the screen, 800-523-2319. As I stated during the introduction, we will be sending out a link to the archived recording of this webinar tomorrow morning. We will include a copy of the PowerPoint presentation in the email that has the link to the archived recording. And finally, if you have any follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to email me, Matt Hyde, at mhyde@tasanet.com. We do take each and every comment under consideration. They help make our programs better, so please do feel free to send me a comment. And if you have any questions about this program, future programs, or past programs that TASA has put on, please feel free to send me a line as well. Otherwise, we're going to end the webinar now, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you again.